The Second Crusade has failed, but its end will open the door to the Plantagenets, that brilliant, avaricious, rebellious, murderous family that will dominate the history of Western Europe for a century to come. Here's their story, so riveting that we still are fascinated by it 900 years later.
Welcome back to Lion's Forge. My name is Beckett, and I want to tell you a story. An epic, true story of 5 kings and the Lion Queen. Season 2, Episode 15, Treason. Young Prince Henry, a medieval man at the age of 15, his father's anointed heir, lived in an unbalanced, tantalizing world, where he would be treated as a king one day, then thrust back into irrelevant powerlessness the next. We know that he attended councils, including Clarendon, that his favor was sought, and that he signed off on royal acts in his father's absence, while the next day he couldn't do so much as grant charters to abbeys on his own. But in the late summer of 1170, young Henry finally seemed right on the verge of his promised inheritance. Heading off to Normandy, Henry left his oldest son in charge of England, and then unexpectedly fell very ill, so convinced in his own mind he was dying that he gave directions for his funeral. For 2 months the Plantagenet world held its breath, but bull-like Henry fought through, emerging from the crisis thinner and weaker, but unquestionably alive. For his eldest son, being so close to the throne and yet so very far away, had to be maddening. He was surrounded by young men his age who wanted excitement, glory, conquest, power, riches. Young men who wouldn't be at all sorry to see their own fathers pushed if they would not step aside. These friends fed young Henry's sense of thwarted entitlement, making rough jokes about kings in name only, who couldn't even get decent rates from the Jewish moneylenders because their prospects were so uncertain. The building pressure within his son's household that he be given more authority became so obvious that Henry weighed in. There would be no stepping aside here. He banned the prince's more inflammatory companions, another sign of Henry's suffocating potency, young Henry's galling dependence. The prince fled to the court of his father-in-law and liege lord, Louis Capet. It's now, in the early 1170s, in the wake of Becket's shocking death, that Henry's enormous, even murderous power, built over the prior 20 years, sired the great rivalries and resentments that would rule the rest of his days on earth. Everything he touched now flared hostility. Louis Capet was openly sympathetic to young Henry. Meanwhile, with an eye to improving tax revenues, in 1171 King Henry decided on a methodical audit of landholdings in Normandy. Norman nobles, among the most stalwart of Plantagenet supporters, were furious. Anti-Henry plots began to blaze like torches in Flanders, in Poitiers, even in his lifelong holding of Anjou, while the French watched with sharp interest. But it was the king's effort to find a wife for his baby son, 6-year-old John, that accidentally gave his growing list of enemies common cause. Henry had gifted his older sons, Henry, Geoffrey, and Richard, with inheritances of lands and castles, but he had entirely passed over the youngest. Young Henry might sulk at having no more than the promise of a kingdom, but John didn't even have that. It's possible that child mortality was such a threat that Henry possibly saw little point in making grants to a little boy, even though it's also true that other little boys of John's class, including his older brothers, were made heirs and even married when they were John's age. Whatever the nature of the oversight, it left the 6-year-old child mockingly nicknamed Lackland, and would become a real-life issue as Henry looked for a wife for his youngest. The king negotiated a good match for John with the daughter of the Count of Maurienne, head of an old and noble family closely allied to the French throne. Adele of Maurienne was Louis Capet's mother. The Count's heiress daughter Alice was now promised to the little prince. She would give her family a link to the English throne, while John would control the province of Maurienne, a pleasant country spread across parts of what are now Switzerland and Italy. More to the point, it controlled all of the mountain passes between Italy and northwestern Europe. This Maurienne alliance was a Henry Plantagenet masterstroke, one which brought even the neighboring Count of Toulouse to heel for the first time in 70 years. Things were going wonderfully well, right up to the day the boy's prospective father-in-law expressed his dismay that John could bring no equivalent territory to the marriage. Henry remedied the problem by giving John 3 castles in ancestral Anjou, at Chinon, a favorite place for the family's Christmas courts, Loudun, and Mirabeau. There was only one difficulty. The properties he so grandly bestowed didn't belong to him. King or no king, he had no right to give those castles to anyone. Considerable fortresses of the Angevin countryside, part of young Henry's inheritance, they belonged to his eldest son. Henry Plantagenet had just given his boys sufficient cause to try to take each other's heads off, an uncanny reprise of his armed clashes with his own younger brother. It can't be said that brothers battling for dominance were a shocking novelty. Savage Queen Constance and her little vipers dated back 7 generations, and they were scarcely unique. The royal family of Barcelona could point to the sobering example of one of its princes, who energetically saw to it that his twin brother died long, long before his time. The Plantagenets themselves could look back a couple of generations to Henry Beauclerc's day, when it took a war between siblings to bring Beauclerc to the throne. Nor was it just royal sons going after royal brothers. Ambitious heirs went after their aging fathers with almost startling fervor, since, when the learned dean of St. Paul's Cathedral dug through old parchments, he found more than 30 examples. But what made the Plantagenet saga so riveting was that Henry Plantagenet had already made his oldest son a king. One could shrug off one boy facing down an overreaching brother, or even determined heirs pushing against laggard parents. But this feud would pit 2 kings against each other. It was a typhoon waiting to break, with not just family harmony, but the future of an entire kingdom at stake. People read the Merlin prophecy again and crossed themselves. "The cub shall awake and shall roar and tear out the tongues of bulls." In Paris, young Henry laid the black grievance of the 3 stolen castles at the feet of his father-in-law and liege lord, Louis Capet. Louis was a most welcoming host. This opportunity to play the role of sympathetic overlord was irresistible. According to chroniclers, Henry sent emissaries to the French court, asking his son to come home. Louis greeted the delegation by asking the source of their message. The natural reply was the King of England, to which Louis coolly responded, "That's absurd. The King of England is at my side." That vastly encouraging remark put momentum behind what so far had just been angry, jumbled unrest. Others turned up the heat. The aristocratic troubadour Bertrand de Born, one of young Henry's friends, not to mention a born troublemaker who had inheritance struggles with his own father, wrote a pointed satire in which a certain great king is prohibited from even claiming the tolls on the roads that supposedly are his. Those jibes hit home. Young Henry headed to Poitiers, his mother's court, avoiding his father's scouts. Eleanor now reappears in the chronicles for the first time in years. While under his mother's roof, it was said, young Henry talked his brothers Richard and Geoffrey into joining him in rebellion. The three had not uniformly acted in concert before. Indeed, not all that long ago, young Henry and Richard had been making war on each other in the Aquitaine, which started when Richard built a castle that edged ever so slightly over the boundary of young Henry's territory. Now, however, all three boys were ready to pile on, given their varied grudges against their father, and there were many, many others delighted to join the family quarrel. Liegemen who had pledged fealty to the Plantagenet sons, Eleanor's lifelong retainers, Capetian allies, barons tired of Henry's rules and Henry's taxes, men who despised Henry for Thomas Becket's death. The geographical range of those who jumped at the chance to shed Henry Plantagenet's control was dizzying, from Scotland to Flanders, to the very heart of England. There's a simple word for what they all participated in: treason. The respectable chronicler Ralph of Coggeshall, who liked Henry, believed that resentful young Henry fired the rebellion, although the troubadour Fantasma put the blame squarely on Henry himself for thwarting his son's legitimate expectations, creating the tinder for what the troubadour called this pitiless war. Others saw an Eve in the garden, convinced it was a jealous, furious Eleanor, enraged by Henry's open affair with Rosamund, who pushed and pressed her sons on. Historian Helen Castor argues that Eleanor's sons were too immature to power the events of 1173, that the Great Revolt had to be headed by someone focused, intelligent, powerful, influential, and aggrieved enough to pull it together. Eleanor had to be that someone. Was she? The assortment of Aquitanian nobles who joined the fight against Henry has always been taken as ready evidence of Eleanor's involvement, especially the presence of her Aquitanian uncle and rumored lover, Ralph de Fay, a key leader of the rebels in the Loire Valley. She had her grievances, God knows. She had brought Henry much of the territory, wealth, and power he now casually regarded as his, open-handed in parceling chunks of the Aquitaine off as boons to his favorites, while he simply set her aside, belittling a woman who matched him in lineage and titles. He bullied and stymied her sons. He increasingly asserted dominance over the lands that belonged to her and to her favorite son Richard. Perhaps particularly galling was Henry's newfound peace with Raymond of Toulouse, that legendary enemy of the Aquitanian dukes. Henry not only recognized the Count's possession of Toulouse, he had him swear fealty to young Henry, as if Richard's independent claims through his mother didn't exist. Adding insult to injury, the Count then took it upon himself to tell Henry to beware of his wife. And there was Rosamund Clifford, riding in glory across the countryside at Henry's side. Worldly wise Eleanor, it's said by many male historians, couldn't possibly have been disturbed by the existence of a royal mistress, such a commonplace in princely circles. Well, perhaps it's true that any woman can spot the difference between a casual fling, where a blind eye can be invaluable, and a serious affair. From all indications we have, Henry loved Rosamund Clifford. Even Eleanor of Aquitaine likely wasn't entirely steeled against the emotions stirred by her husband's passion for this youthful rival, played out ever more publicly as years went by. The scorching pain of being shunted off to the side was no less a blow 800 years ago than it would be today. Maybe the Clifford girl didn't mean a thing, but maybe she was a weighty personal score to be settled. We may never have solid proof that the great lady was the guiding hand of the rebellion, as has been theorized, but she housed her sons, the plotters, and she didn't warn Henry. To people in her world, it would prove another jarring shock from the most powerful woman in Europe. While the dean of St. Paul's Cathedral had found 30 examples of noble sons rebelling against fathers, he could find nothing about queens fighting kingly husbands. Eleanor was already famous throughout Europe for her confounding life, that provocative mix of adultery, disloyalty, and independent willfulness, from Paris to Antioch to London to Poitiers. She had become the very personification of the female sins of disobedience and lust. Medieval wives, even queenly wives, were to be dutiful consorts, vassals of the men they married. Instead, she'd gotten herself free of Louis Capet, and then took her household off to live entirely apart from the epic Henry Plantagenet. Now, she was attacking the very fabric of the greatest dynasty in Western Europe. We have a letter sent by the Archbishop of Rouen to the Queen. "We deplore that you have left your husband, and have opened the way for your children to rise up against their father. Unless you return to your husband, you will be the cause of widespread disaster." Here was a true Eve in the flesh, frighteningly independent, lacking male control, threatening chaos, dragging in her wake death, fire, torment, incalculable loss. As young Henry energetically lined up allies with lavish promises of new lands, new revenues, and new titles to be cut from the old cloth of his father's reign, preliminary brush fires broke out in half a dozen places. At the solemn investiture of an archbishop, shockingly disrupted when heralds shouted that young Henry had not sanctioned the election, or in the Aquitaine, where armed men were said to have dragged King Henry's cowed ministers away from their desks. According to one medieval historian with the clarifying perspective of centuries, the whole Plantagenet Empire had become a vast hotbed of treason. In addition to his own sons and even his wife, the list of men willing to break every vow of fealty to Henry was a long one. Chester, Leicester, Gloucester, the Mowbrays, Moulins, Angoulême, the Montforts, Talbourg, Huntington, Leinster, Ferrer, Derby, Norfolk, Flanders, the Louisians, Blois, Boulogne, the Bretons under Ralph de Fourgère, the King of the Scots. Joined by Louis Capet, King of the French, they nodded grimly to one another and set out to make war on Henry Plantagenet. On June 29th, 1173, a Friday, a Flemish army was sighted heading for the town of Driancourt, crossing the Norman border. The revolt was on. Louis Capet and young Henry attacked at Verneuil, one of Henry's Norman castles, 50-odd miles west of Paris. News came that Henry's senior officer in Normandy, the very core of his kingdom, had defected to young Henry, taking 100 knights and their battle flags. The Scots surged across their borders. Henry faced the storm from Rouen, where, for quite a while, he seemed to simply ignore the landmines exploding all around him. Instead of surprise or anger, he conveyed nothing so much as disdainful indifference. In reality, calm was essential. He couldn't afford even the slightest show of fear without the risk of driving his few supporters off in panic. So rather than act like a hunted man, he acted like a king. His impressive display of unconcern probably reinforced by his understanding of the disorganization inevitable among so many self-interested rebels. He appointed some bishops. He named a new chancellor. One wonders with what thoughts of the dead man who had been the best among them. He did send letters across the continent to his many supposed friends, but the letters yielded little by way of active help. To face down the massive rebellion, he had an army consisting largely of Flemish mercenaries. Excellent, but expensive. One old legend said he had to pledge the sword of state used at his coronation as security for their wages. He made a quick trip across the Channel to brace his English allies, most of whom were kin or lifelong friends. One was his longtime co-justiciar, Richard de Lucy, now in his 80s. Another was his bastard son Geoffrey, who, like many illegitimate aristocrats, had become a bishop. Once again, a man of God, forbidden to shed blood, would be strapping on a sword. This seems a rather frail start for Henry, but it eventually carried the day, especially when combined with the other side's sheer bad luck, including the death by crossbow of one of the key rebel leaders. Rebellions based on little but shared hatred need success. Without it, there's not much to hold them together. Within a few months, the insurrection started to crack, a few mutinous strongholds surrendering here and there. Louis Capet, never the most aggressive of warlords, offered a truce which Henry seemed anxious to accept, evidently open to the idea of ending the war against his own sons. Yet shades of Henry's meetings with Becket back in the day hopelessly stalled these peace talks, just as they had with the Archbishop of Canterbury years before. Henry would hold out his hand filled with gifts. The difficulty arose when they were not the gifts anyone wanted. This time he offered his princely sons half of everything he owned, except the right to rule in any Plantagenet territory. The paltry offer was indignantly refused. Some said the rebel Earl of Leicester was so enraged by the negotiations that he drew his sword on the King of England. The war was renewed. It's interesting to read the names of those on both sides as the rebellion sparked again. The ferocious Leicester was the son of one of Henry's most trusted officials, the former Chief Justiciar, deceased by now, the old man no doubt turning and turning in his grave at his son's defection. Leicester's friend, Hugh Bigod, faced off against loyalist Randolph de Broc. The elderly Bigod, now in his 70s, had thrown in his lot with the rebels. He'd never been a Plantagenet admirer, this man who once claimed Henry's grandfather had changed his mind about the succession on his deathbed, thus cheating Henry's mother of her inheritance. De Broc, fighting for the king, had been a prime enemy of Thomas Becket's, now considerably enriched by theft from the Canterbury estates. Despite his advanced years, Bigod won the skirmish, burning the castle de Broc defended, but old Bigod would soon have some very bad luck. Joining hot-headed Leicester, their own army of 3,000 Flemish mercenaries was cut to pieces in the marshes at Fornham St. Genevieve in the east of England. Townspeople ran out with pitchforks and scythes to help the king's men, trapping awkward armored rebels in weed-choked ditches and sinkholes. The ones who weren't disemboweled or beheaded stumbled and drowned in the blood-tainted water. Leicester's French knights were captured, as were Leicester and his wife, the Countess, who had gone with him on his campaign. The Leicesters would go to prison in Falaise, probably in the truly forbidding ancestral fortress castle of the Dukes of Normandy. And so it went for another awful year, on both sides of the Channel. Young Henry made common cause against his father with the Flemish throne and the French king. Richard attacked his father's vassals in Poitou. The frightening Scots rampaged. Men died. Men were crippled for life. Towns were sacked and burned. Crops were ruined. Lives were ruined. The advantage to either side, always slight and always fragile, would crumble as soon as it was won. In Britain, the breakdown in law and order was becoming ruinous, just as in the bitter times of the anarchy. According to one story, the citizens of London became so desperate to control the constant theft and vandalism born of the violence of the war that they armed their servants. There were widespread, terrifying rumors that young Henry was in the final stages of planning an invasion of the island, ready to fight his father in the tight streets of England's cities and across the broad green fields of England's countryside. It would be a general civil war, deadly, terrible, bloody, ruinous. What people of the time would swear turned the tide for Henry was his first ever appearance at Becket's tomb in July 1174, years after he had promised the Pope he would atone for his murky role in Becket's death. Coming at a dead run from Normandy, Henry put on pilgrim sackcloth and walked barefoot in the dirt to Canterbury Cathedral. The 41-year-old king prayed on his knees at graveside for a day and a night, taking no food or rest, and then gave himself up to a public whipping, stripped to the waist. In the morning, after hearing Mass, he left what chroniclers said were rich gifts in money and endowments, and rode 60 miles to London, 9 hours on the road, still fasting. Remarkably soon thereafter, the King of Scotland was in chains at Richmond Castle. The rebellion was about to break. We've come to the end of our story for the time being. I am Becket Arnold, narrating from the book Lion's Forge, adapted for us by the author Karen Markle Knabb. Thank you to Francis Butt for voicing our introduction. If you like what you hear, please give us a rating, follow our channel, and share us with your friends. Most importantly, please join us again June 24th for the next episode of Lion's Forge, available everywhere you get your favorite podcasts, including on YouTube with video episode trailers. Visit us on Facebook, where you can ask questions, leave reviews, and interact with me. Until next time, thank you for listening.